Asian-Specific American Heritage Month. Nearly half of the U.S. Asian population, 45%, lives in the West, with nearly a third, 30%, in California alone. California has an Asian population of roughly 6.7 million in 2019, by far the nation's largest. California became home to thriving immigrant communities from China, Japan, the Philippines, Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Hong Kong, Thailand, and other parts of Asia. The greatest concentration of 3 million Asian Americans was in the San Francisco Bay Area. Larger numbers also settled in Los Angeles, Orange, San Diego, Fresno, Sutter, Yuba, and Sacramento counties. As more and more Chinese migrated to the U.S., Americans grew more and more intolerant of them, which caused them to create Chinatowns across America. However, they had to face massive acts of opposition and oppression such as lynching, vandalism, arson, and robbery. During this time, the government often turned a blind eye instead of coming to the aid of the Chinese. It even went so far as to respond to the xenophobia, fear of Chinese, of the time by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act, legislation that prohibited the immigration of all Chinese laborers to the U.S. The 1871 Chinese Massacre was one of the worst lynchings of our nation's history. The Chinese Massacre of 1871 was a racial massacre that occurred on October 24, 1871 in Los Angeles, California, when a mob of around 500 white and Hispanic people entered Old Chinatown and attacked, bullied, robbed, and murdered Chinese residents. Through the 1870s, the United States was gripped by a severe economic depression that led to shortages, high unemployment, and particularly hard times for the working class across the country. In 1877, strikers rioted in numerous cities across the United States. In the immediate aftermath of the riots, Chinese residents were left with over $100,000 in damage to clean up, including broken windows, burned buildings, and looting stores. Limited to Chinatown for rebuilding and cultivating their business interests, many struggled to recover from the riots. Meanwhile, China's laborers hired were paid coolie wages, which was the reduced sums paid by wealthy employees to Chinese staff. The Great San Francisco Earthquake of 1906. In 1906, the Great San Francisco Earthquake resulted in many fires, one of which destroyed the birth and immigration records, allowing many Chinese to claim American birth and thus citizenship. Because the Chinese Exclusion Act allowed the children of citizens to migrate, many Chinese men migrated as paper sons. Not actually related, they claimed kinship on paper only.
After a 3-week journey across the ocean, he arrived at Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay. He was detained, locked up in the dormitories for about 5 weeks. He said that the ordeal of the humiliating physical examination and the dreaded interrogation was a very difficult process for him. These interrogations could last for days. They prepared for this process by studying coaching books that were given to them by immigration brokers. You can see it's all the questions that they were likely to be asked, the birth dates of your grandparents, who were the school teacher. But this is supposed to be my father's village, and who lived in which house, and where was the well, where were the outhouses, which direction that the ancestral temple faced. My father, he lived in the shadows of society, and he was always afraid of calling attention to himself, of running into the law.
Here to film your story. I'm going to tell the whole world you were a paper son. I hope that's okay. In English, right under his picture here, it says Young, Young being his paper surname.
Japanese American life. California's Japanese American population also faced prejudice, which culminated in an unofficial U.S.-Japanese agreement in 1907-08 to slow or stop the flow of immigrants from Japan. The exception was wives and children of the men who had already migrated. Since most Japanese Americans born in Japan were single men when they migrated, it was not uncommon for them to find wives through correspondence and the exchange of photographs. Many of these women came to the United States as picture brides. In 1924, the United States passed a law barring further immigration of Japanese women, evidently to discourage the establishment of families and communities of Japanese Americans. 1913, California passes the Alien Land Act. California law prohibits Asian immigrants from owning agricultural land or possessing long-term leases over it, but permitted leases lasted up to 3 years. It affected the Chinese, Indian, Japanese, and Korean immigrants and farmers in California. Implicitly, the law was primarily directed at the Japanese.
When Japanese, early ones, that desired to settle here, they were able to buy land. But when 1913 Alien Land Law, which stopped them from buying land, they're up against the wall, otherwise they're not able to buy land. As their children grew older, they bought land under the children's name, which the children were underage. And that's how some of the farmers was able to buy land. But otherwise, they didn't want the Japanese buying land.
Despite laws preventing land ownership, the Japanese American population established homes, churches, and businesses. In addition to labor jobs with the railroads, in the fields, and in domestic jobs, they established their own enterprise in fish and agriculture, partially in Central California. Indian American life. In the early parts of the 20th century, small numbers of Punjabi immigrants migrated from India to Central California as farmers. After 1917, pressured by labor interest groups, Congress barred immigration from India due to a gender imbalance in the Indian community. But a good number of the Punjabi farmers in California's Imperial Valley married local Mexican women. Korean American life. How did LA come to have the largest Korean population in the U.S.? Driven by the ongoing famines, political instability, and limited economic opportunities that plagued the Korean peninsula, Koreans arrived in Hawaii, then a U.S. territory, to work as laborers on sugar plantations. With the demand for cheap manual labor and the influential role of the American Presbyterian missionary Dr. Hoyce Allen, who had ties to the plantation ventures in Hawaii, by 1905, Koreans from Hawaii began arriving in California. For over 20 years, a Presbyterian mission in Los Angeles' Bunker Hill neighborhood was a focal point for the community. Religious and secular organizations were influential in supporting the newcomers on the mainland. The area grew as a home away from home for Korean immigrants. Because Japan became a colonial occupation of Korea in 1910 and afterwards, exclusionary immigration and land ownership laws that targeted Japan also affected the lives of Koreans. Filipino American life. At first, Filipinos freely migrated to the United States because the American conquest of the Philippines in 1902 granted them U.S. national status. The 1920s saw a huge influx of Filipinos into California, mainly in response to the need for agricultural workers following the exclusion of Japanese and Chinese. By the 1930s, more than half of the Filipinos in the United States lived in California. Many of them were brought in as strikebreakers, which led to racial tension, especially with Mexicans and whites, who perceived them as taking away work. In 1929, tensions erupted into violence in Exeter, California, when a mob attacked a Filipino camp. More riots and violence followed in San Jose, San Francisco, and Watsonville, where conflict arose not only from labor competition, but also because local European Americans were opposed to Filipinos dating white women. The vast majority of Filipinos were male seasonal laborers, well-dressed men, but no women. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited Filipinos from marrying white people in the state of California. It wasn't until the 1948 court case, Perez v. Sharp of Los Angeles, California, that interracial marriage was legalized in the state of California. 19 years later, in 1967, interracial marriage was legalized nationwide. Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Korean, and Filipino Americans established communities in California despite exclusionary laws and discrimination.